This is Professor Mike Ventola from Sandhills Community College, bringing you Grass of the Week. Our guest today is going to be George Thompson, pictured here at the 2005 U.S. Open, stimp metering, and looking after the putting green at Pinehurst Resorts. Creeping Bentgrass, Agrostis stolonifera, was previously Agrostis palustra, so if you hear that term, that's what it used to be called, but it had recently been changed to Agrostis stolonifera. It has creeping stolons, a long membranous ligule. This is probably the most prominent feature when you take that leaf and push it back, but you can see it can get thick and thatchy very quickly. This picture shows two different grasses that are exactly the same. One was never mowed, the other was maintained mowed at a height under 1/10 of an inch. That is the strength of this grass. It can maintain a very low height of cut, but let go loose without mowing, it can be a big problem. You can never really get this grass down to this height. There are four types of bent grasses that we may talk about in the course: colonial bentgrass, red top, velvet bentgrass, and our focus for today, creeping bentgrass. I'd like you to take your book, the Turfgrass Pest Management Manual, page 13, and we'll go through the dichotomous key of this grass. Notice that it's a rolled grass, and we're eventually going to get to over here, which will say that it's on page 18. So bentgrass are going to follow along in the next slide, which will show us how to get there. First, if there were a seed head on that uncut grass, and I'll show you some seed heads later from pure seed testing, it would be panicum and have a very tiny seed. It is rolled, so if you put it in your fingers and roll it, it's not going to flip at all. It will be rolled. The ligule, this is the prominent feature, that's why it's highlighted in red here, is membranous and long. It pops out and may have small hairs on it. I don't really notice the small hairs when I look at it, but once I see that ligule, I know pretty much that it's creeping bentgrass. There is no auricle. Stolons are evident, hence the name Agrostis stolonifera. This is the strength of the grass, why it spreads so rapidly and also survives at such a low height of cut. There are no rhizomes, so if you see rhizomes, it is definitely not creeping bentgrass. It might be colonial bentgrass, but it's not creeping. An open sheath, divided collar, and a leaf blade that has a rough edges and comes to a sharp point. So notice it's not waxy on the back like perennial ryegrass. So here's a nice little picture of that ligule, and that ligule is long. Ligule is almost as tall as the blade is wide. So by pulling that leaf back, the ligule really pops out. When it escapes or gets into, this is a Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue lawn at the clubhouse at Pinehurst Resorts, and you can see that the area I'm circling is creeping bentgrass contamination, and that can look fine for a while, but it's going to get puffy and kill itself with thatch. Maintained with lots of money, mowing, top dressing, aerification, it can be an excellent putting surface, and even this guy here didn't complain too much about it. So this is Chris Hartwiger. He's one of our guests for a future podcast. He is here stimp metering the greens, the first putting green at Pinehurst number 2 for the 2005 Open. Here are some USGA physicists. They're checking the resilience of the grass. They drop this hammer on the grass and it bounces back, and they measure the angle of deflection, which tells you how hard the grass is, which we used in 2005 to help water the greens. Softer greens were watered more, harder greens were watered more, softer greens were watered less. And this is a very important part of bentgrass management, this syringing. This is Paul Jett, the superintendent at Pinehurst number 2, and he is out there watering some of the high spots and some of the harder spots by eye, and this does take feel. This is something where you want a trained operator. You don't just want anybody out there to go throw water to it. You can cause a lot more damage with excess water to bentgrass. So this is where superintendents in the Carolinas really earn their money. All of the grass that originally came to the United States as South German mixed bent. It was a mix of colonial, velvet, and creeping. Mostly colonial, actually, but what survived from those original plots was mostly creeping. And the pen cross that we have today comes from this original seed. The bentgrass enjoys a cool, humid environment, particularly that of the Northeast. That's why it survived above the colonial and the others out on Long Island and some of the first early golf courses. They were able to select the best grasses that survived under those low height cut, and this has gone on to this day. So all the new cultivars come from selections from the old. It is susceptible to stresses. Drought, traffic, and disease are all a problem with this grass. The original cultivar pen cross had about 100 clones in it. Pen Eagle and some of these were selected from that, but a big break happened when we came to lower growing types. Particularly the G's. G2 is the one at Pinehurst. L93 is a grass that is dollar spot resistant, and Crenshaw is much more heat tolerant. This is the grass that's at Forest Creek Country Club across the street from the college. So here's how it's done. The grass is planted and it's evaluated. You can see that the pen cross plot here does not look as well as the L93. Crenshaw's doing fine. Regent, that I've never heard of except in this test, has not done well. So we evaluate. We go back. This is Dr. Melody Frazier. She's planted. All of these plants were planted from one seed. They're one clone, and you can see that they grow at different rates. This one here might be a very dwarf type, so it might be good for really low height of cut for good quality, but it's not going to spread as much, which would be bad for filling in ball marks, and it's probably not going to produce as much seed like this one here. We've got seed coming up, so that's where Dr. Frazier is able to evaluate. And each person involved in the process has something that they would like more or less. So these students are looking at that, and some of the dwarf types look really well, but excessive dwarfness probably doesn't work. Here's the seed. One thing you want to look for is an awn. This is annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass has an awn, and an awn is a little structure that comes up off the top of the seed. Perennial ryegrass does not have an awn. This is creeping bentgrass. This is no awn. Colonial bentgrass has an awn. So there's a law case that I was involved in where the colonial bentgrass was sold to somebody who thought they were buying perennial creeping bentgrass, and we had to take those plants, grow it up to seed, get the seed, and prove that it was not creeping bentgrass so that they were able to get a settlement. So when you're buying seed, avoid the hassle of lawyers and all that stuff. Know how to identify seed. So now I'm going to get to our guest, George Thompson. George has over 35 years experience as a golf course superintendent. This is back in his early days when he first started. We're talking today about creeping bentgrass with George Thompson, the first ever golf course superintendent inducted into the Carolinas Golf Hall of Fame. George was superintendent at Country Club of North Carolina for 15 years, and before that he was superintendent at Columbia Country Club in Washington, D.C. He was instrumental in some of the first variety trials that were actually done on a golf course, and hopefully we'll have some insights into the selection and use of creeping bentgrass. Welcome, George. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Hey, George, so we're talking about creeping bentgrass today, and I'd like to ask you first, just when you're out in the field, what do you use, what sort of characteristics do you use to identify this grass?
Normally the ligule and the rolled in the bud and the stolons, it's pretty easy to pick out of a mixed stand.
And when you were at Country Club of North Carolina, you did some research with bentgrass. In what place was that? At what height?
We cooperated with NC State on some trials. We had 20 cultivars and 4 different reps. We had 2 different mowing heights. We had approximately 8 by 10 foot plots that were cut in half, and half of the plot was mowed at 1/8 of an inch and half of it was mowed around 150 thousandths or 160.
So that was all putting green.
That was all putting green grass.
Now when you were up in the D.C. area, did you ever experiment with bentgrass for fairways?
We did some fairways up there, but mostly we didn't have the technology to maintain bentgrass fairways in those days. We didn't have the technology, we didn't have the equipment, we didn't have the know-how to do it, and we didn't have the irrigation systems.
Do you think one of the biggest problems was thatch production?
I think it was, but it was also lack of refined irrigation and the fact that you can now top dress fairways much more easily, and you can aerate fairways much more easily, and keep the thatch under control. And also a lot of it's to do with irrigation. Smaller heads covering more critical areas.
I know one of the things about bentgrass, when I was working for Reed Funk, I had a plot of tall fescue that had some contamination with some bentgrass in it, and I thought it was the greatest thing in the world. And then he said, well, you watch that, Mike, and you see if that's a great plot. And it had gotten so puffy and open, it was really just kind of grew itself to death. So that was one of the things that I look for when I look for bentgrass escaping.
We were also using ground-driven fairway machines or mowers, and the hydraulic machines make so much difference on bentgrass fairways.
Yeah, that's right. Just to get, because the machine gets bogged down and you have to keep it real sharp. So in the future, where do you see the use of bentgrass going? I know there seems to be a wave in this area to move away from bentgrass, but do you see a future for it?
I think you're still going to see the majority of the greens in Raleigh and Charlotte and Pinehurst being bentgrass. There's so many new varieties coming out that I think the industry will keep up with it. The breeders will keep up with the new varieties, and you'll continue to have a low heat tolerant varieties that can be mowed closely, so you can keep up to 10 or 12 foot stem meter readings, and also lower fertility, lower water requirements. So there's still quite a few in the pipeline that we haven't even used yet.
In your opinion, what are the major weaknesses of this grass as a putting green grass?
Mostly, I would say the organic matter buildup with the new cultivars. It's hard to keep the organic matter at a reasonable level, and I think that unless we can get that under control, that people are going to be rebuilding more often. But 10, 12 years was probably the average length of a bentgrass putting green in this area, anyhow, due to foreign grasses.
Now, what's your opinion on diseases with this grass?
Well, right now we're dealing with this summer root dysfunction, and it seems to be the disease du jour of all the new cultivars. But they're finding out more about summer root dysfunction, and I think the industry will find a cure for that. Maybe it even will come through different nutrients, different pH levels, different fertility levels.
Yeah, it seems Dr. Treadway's seeing that it's the grass that's being pushed to the limit that's getting that when it's cut.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with people are mowing too close, and they're also not feeding enough. But yet it's a double standard because the new dwarf bentgrasses require a low mowing, so you can possibly raise the height up to 130 or 140 or maybe even 150, but once you get much above that, it seems like you're doing a disservice to the bentgrass.
Now, I've heard a story from when you were back, kind of acting as a night waterman with this grass. Now, what was your first experience with bentgrass?
I was working in Chicago on bentgrass fairways, which were bentgrass on a good year and Poania fairways on a bad year, depending on what species you were looking for in the fairway. But we had one of my rites of passage, I guess, were as a night watering man, and we had to go out there at night and move sprinklers every 15 minutes or every 20 minutes or every half hour as the soil dictated. But it was I started out as an intern in Chicago in March one year, and I worked a couple weeks, and the next thing I knew I was working day and night as a night watering man and also as a day greenskeeper. So
what club was that, George?
That was a club called Ravislow, which was a good club on the south side or southeast side of Chicago, and
so that was
nice experience.
After you went to UMass?
That was an internship from UMass, 5-month internship.
So not very different than a lot of our students are going to do here pretty soon.
Same idea. It's a great opportunity for a student to go on that internship. Great learning experience.
Now, who was your instructor at UMass?
Dr. Troll, who was a DSA award recipient from GCSAA, one of the great mentors.
Now, what did he teach you guys about bentgrass back then?
Well, don't put 2,4-D on it was one thing right back in those days. We were learning the hard way on bentgrass, but bentgrass was top dress and aerify. Keep it mowed short, and syringe it as needed. Judicious use of water, not much difference than it is today. Back then we had mostly vegetative varieties that were sprigged or stolenized.
Similar to where the Bermuda is today?
Similar to what Bermuda is like today. Pencross came out in the late 50s, but it still hadn't been widely received yet when I was in school in 62 and 63.
Now Pencross is kind of a long bygone standard in a lot of ways.
Pencross is kind of a dinosaur now, but it was the grass of choice for almost 40 years.
Well, great. That's a good start for them, and hopefully they'll learn a little bit more about bentgrass from this Grass of the Week talk. Music for this podcast is brought to you by Tim Haley and the Sand Hills Community College Jazz Band.